Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for attending this session on fossil fuel subsidy reform. My name is Marcel Vernooy. I'm the Deputy Permanent Representative of the Kingdom of the Netherlands here in Geneva. And I have the honor to moderate this event on behalf of the Friends of Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform. I would firstly like to thank our colleagues from New Zealand for the much appreciated preparatory work. And we're also very grateful to have our distinguished panelists today. I'll come to that shortly. And from the outset, thanks a lot already to the WTO Secretariat for facilitating this session. Today's topic is not a novel issue. Various prominent international fora, such as the UNFCCC, the APEC, the G20, the G7, have highlighted the need for joint work on fossil fuel subsidy reform. In December 2021, here in Geneva, some WTO members proposed to advance a discussion also at the World Trade Organization. And last June, a ministerial statement was issued by 47 members. And these members, and I quote, reached the understanding to seek the rationalization and phase out of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies that encourage wasteful consumption. Second, recognize that reform needs to take fully into account the specific needs and conditions of developing countries. And third, these members will share information and experiences to advance discussions in the WTO aimed at achieving ambitious and effective disciplines on inefficient fossil fuel subsidies that encourage wasteful consumption. They will also encourage other WTO members to join in those efforts and will elaborate concrete options to advance this issue at the WTO in advance of the 13th WTO Ministerial Conference, end quote. I believe the initiative can be considered to be part of the urgent response to multiple interlinked crises. Yesterday, at the opening of this excellent Trade and Environment Week, the chairperson of the Committee on Trade and Environment, Ambassador Manley, reiterated that we have to work together and act to tackle climate change and biodiversity loss. And the consequences of environmental degradation induce socio-economic tensions. Vice versa, human conflicts in an interconnected world hamper the ability to take joint action needed for sustainable development. Furthermore, today's high food and energy prices are directly impacting citizens worldwide, and governments have a heavy responsibility to urgently design effective measures in response. There are, however, positives as well. Awareness is growing fast that energy is a precious resource which cannot be taken for granted. Scarcity, declining common availability, and higher prices for energy are a huge problem, but these also do present opportunities to structurally reduce waste of energy and use energy much more efficiently. It can also drive a market-based transition towards green energy. Ladies and gentlemen, today this session aims to provide us with pertinent facts for an informed discussion. The eminent experts in our panel will unwind challenges and opportunities on the short term and in the longer term. How can we avoid that measures needed for the short term create impediments to safeguard the future in the long term? How can we learn from each other, help each other, and what role is there for the World Trade Organization to play? The Friends have invited distinguished experts, being Tour Muta, online with us, as you see, who's Senior Energy Analyst of the International Energy Agency. Frank van Tongeren, also online, Head of Unit at the Trade and Agriculture Directorate of the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. And Jonas Kuhl is next to me here, of the Energy Program of the International Institute for Sustainable Development. After their presentations, we'll move into questions and answers. Most likely I'll have a few questions myself, given my attachment to this topic. And of course, also in the room, colleagues, you are invited to raise your flag. And those who follow us on Zoom can use the chat function. James Lester from the New Zealand delegation here will keep an eye on your chats, remarks, and time permitting, we'll also take a few questions from those who follow us online. So with these words, it's with great pleasure that I would now like to introduce the first speaker, Mr. Tura Mutta of the International Energy Agency. Mr. Mutta, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for very kind introduction, Mr. Vernic. I totally agree with your introduction of this issue. It is very difficult and very important situation for fossil fuel subsidy reform. So, as introduced, firstly, I am Tora Mutta from International Energy Agency, and I'm really glad to have this opportunity with distinguished speakers and audience. Today, I'm as the first speaker of this session, I would like to discuss kinds of the scene-setting discussion, that is what is needed to tackle with the current crisis, and then what is needed to continue to reform fossil fuel subsidies reforms in this difficult situation. So first, I'll speak about IEA's views on current energy crisis. First of all, energy crisis. Our view is we are in the middle of the first truly global energy crisis. We had energy crisis in the past, oil crisis in the 70s, but we think current crisis is completely different at its scale. Why? It is very simple. The country that invaded of Ukraine was, as of 24th of February, the largest gas exporting country in the world, and one of the top oil exporters of the world. In addition, a major player of global coal and uranium market. That is the reason why we think now it is the first truly global energy crisis. And as you know, it is impacting all regions, but particularly we think impacting on developing countries. There is a very heartbreaking number in my view, that is, we have been measuring how many people are not in access to electricity for 20 years. For 20 years, we have been analyzing this number, and every year, the number of people has decreased. It was slowly but firmly declining last 20 years. After the COVID crisis, however, the 20-year trend is reversing, and the number of people is now increasing for the first time because of current economic hardship and affordability of energy. Currently, additions of 20 million people are losing the access to electricity. That is what is going on in the energy sector, in the energy crisis. And the situation of global energy market could get even tougher. Oil and gas markets are likely to remain volatile, with prices staying at elevated level. So, to discuss clean energy transition in this difficult situation, we think we need separate facts and fictions in the energy sector. That would be a good starting point to discuss. The first point, the first mistaken idea is that clean energy boom has caused the current energy crisis. That's simply not true. Not true. Because we are communicating with many governments all in the world all the time, and none of them complain about having too much clean energy. No one says so. The fact is quite the opposite. There are regrets that they didn't go faster with the deployment of renewables and improvement in efficiency. So, faster transitions can help us to tackle with this crisis. The second mistaken idea is that today's crisis is a huge setback against tackling climate change. We don't believe this to be true. When we look back at history, we see that the oil shocks of the 70s led the major advances in how we produce and use energy. So, today's crisis also can drive similar changes, and we think some signs of this are already visible. In China, for example, now EVs account for 26% of all car sales. It is up from just 3.5% in early 2020. This is a quite big jump. So, against the backdrop of these energy situations, what is the implication for fossil fuel subsidies reforms? That is an issue we should investigate. The IEA has been tracking the size of global fossil fuel consumption subsidies for more than 10 years. By recognizing the price gap between end-user prices and reference prices as estimated consumption subsidies, this is the way we have been analyzing the volume of fossil fuel consumption subsidies. And in this regular study, the amount of global consumption subsidies once decreased in 2020, it is largely due to global low fuel prices. But since last year, it has been increasing again, and it raised more than $500 billion last year in 2021. And it is quite likely to increase more again in 2022. In addition, considering other types of subsidies, such as upstream support or R&D subsidies, including these types of subsidies, OECD colleagues and the IEA jointly estimated that the total amount of subsidies has reached $700 billion last year. Moreover, besides our regular price gap analysis, our timely data collection found that many governments have implemented new consumer support measures, including tax exemptions and price regulations, as well as subsidies. And the total amount of this could be similar in magnitude to the fossil fuel subsidies total for 2021. So around 500 billion or things like that. So most of this has been announced from advanced economies, not only emerging or developing countries. most of them has been announced from advanced economies. So, which implies how sensitive issue energy prices are for policymakers worldwide. So, as you already know well, one of the most visible costs of fossil fuel consumption subsidies is the fiscal burden on countries. This has been particularly severe among fuel importing countries. For example, in Malaysia, the government estimates the budget for fossil fuels will reach $7 billion this year. $7 million is equivalent to 12% of national fiscal revenue in Malaysia, quite a huge volume. In Indonesia, for example, its state subsidy spending last year surpassed its budget allocation by 40%. And it is likely to be the same this year as well. So, the implication is these fiscal pressures could limit the capability of governments to tackle with the current crisis. In particular, to help the vulnerable part of citizens. In this context, we think fossil fuel subsidies reform need to make sure that such people should not be left. So, inclusion of vulnerable citizens are the vital part of the reforms. Inclusion is the vital part. And there are many options and ideas for this. For example, more targeted subsidies are most notable example, and direct fiscal support for vulnerable citizens should be also effective as well. Last but not least, needless to say, it is essential to move ahead, not just with emergency measures, but also with structural measures. Structural changes are important, such as better insulated homes or use of heat pumps, or deployment of electrified transport. These structural changes are a critical point for the reform as well. So I stop here. Thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mutta. Your presentation is an excellent start, very rich. You highlighted the magnitude of the energy crisis affecting us all, and it's striking example that you gave that there are not more people with electricity because of the crisis, and you also referred to the heavy responsibility on governments with their fiscal burden. At the same time, highlighted it's also an impetus for tackling climate change and working on an inclusive manner. And of course, the fact-based notion that you flagged, we're very pleased to work with you of the International Energy Agency. So thanks a lot for this first introduction. I have the feeling that actually where you stopped, Mr. Frank van Tongeren will continue. Frank, it's a pleasure to have you with us. It's a pleasure personally to see you again, by the way. And you're very welcome to continue with your introduction to this session. Thank you.
Yes, well, thank you very much, Chair Marcel. Good afternoon. I will try to share my screen. That's the first test of my ability here. So if just someone could say if this is okay.
Yes, we can see your screen.
This is okay.
Yes,
Good. Very good. So first of all, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to share some thoughts with you in this event. I will also try to add some facts to the debate on the question of support measures in times of energy crisis. As already Toru mentioned, I mean, we are, of course, currently in a global energy crisis. Toru has mentioned devastating effects on households, especially in poor countries. We've also done some calculations just to see what the high gas prices would mean for industries, costs in industries. That's what you see on this slide here, which are also quite sizable. Energy gas prices, especially hurting European countries, depending on their energy mix and their industrial structure, of course. And as Toru has mentioned, in addition, these high energy prices affect the most vulnerable households. So governments feel compelled to do something, to take measures to counter the most undesirable effects of this energy crisis. But then, of course, the crucial question is how. Now, not all measures are created equal, as we know, and ideally, these support measures to counteract high energy prices in the current situation should be targeted towards those that are most in need and to limit fiscal costs of interventions. They should also not act to lower marginal energy prices to avoid weakening incentives to reduce energy use, especially when supply is tight, as it is now. Measures should also be limited in time, as firms and households will need to adapt over time, and consistent with the transition to carbon neutrality. Now, these are general principles, but they come on top of yet another set of general principles, because we would also these measures to be transparent, proportionate, and non-discriminatory. Now, all this is not very easy to implement, obviously. And currently, one should note also that measures acting on lowering energy prices could indeed relieve temporary inflationary pressures, and so help to lower inflationary expectations. But in the longer run, they do not allow for demand to adjust to supply constraints. So this could become a bigger problem going forward in the future. Now, the principles of how measures should be designed are easy to spell out, but they are less easy to implement in practice. Targeting support is already not very easy. It should use criteria that go just beyond income to also include elements such as household financial vulnerability, or the quality of their housing, the location of their housing, and things like that. In many countries, targeting is challenging because social benefit systems are not very well developed, or have a hard time reaching many of those potentially in need. For example, because there's a high degree of informality or lack of institutional capacity. But even in countries where social benefit systems are more sophisticated, effective targeting still requires more than simply increasing existing transfers. Innovations in transfer mechanisms may be needed to ensure that groups that are most vulnerable to the energy price shock are actually reached. So just as an example, imagine a nurse who is essentially a self-employed person who has to drive by car or a moped to visit patients in the rural area. She may have a decent income, but she would be significantly affected now with the current high prices because she does not have an alternative to her car or the moped, and therefore relies on fossil fuels. Evidence for Germany shows that existing social and fiscal systems are not entirely capable of addressing the additional burden of higher energy prices in a finely targeted way. And additional fine-tuned measures may be needed to avoid social hardship by limiting budgetary costs. Now with all that, what have countries done so far? So we have compiled an inventory of measures taken to tackle the current energy crisis. This is a summary of measures implemented since October 2021, so 1 year ago, focusing just on income and price support measures, and in total they amount to $360 billion. Now, is this big or small? Well, to make a little perspective here, it's about half of Switzerland's GDP in 2020. So that's, I think, quite a big number. In addition, the vast majority of those measures had an effect on prices. We call them price support measures, which is on the right side of the slide on your screen. And they are not targeted. Among those measures, we find electricity price controls, reduced electricity excise taxes and network fees, value-added tax reductions, and fuel excise reductions or exemptions, and also rebates at the pump, as we have in the country from which I'm just now speaking. In addition, most of these measures directly support the use and production of fossil fuels. And that again amounts to a total of about $264 billion. Finally, in terms of the numbers, most of the measures now target firms. That's your red bar here, which was not the case a few months ago when we made this inventory. So there's now more support going to firms and industries relative to support going to households in the countries that we're covering in this inventory, which is all the OECD countries, plus China, India, Indonesia, Romania, and South Africa. So what should countries do now? As already said by Toru, governments urgently need to shift to targeted income support, even if this is more difficult to implement. Some innovation will be needed to deliver such support, more targeted support through transfers of vouchers to households, but also firms. This is more fair and effective, but also limiting the effects on government budgets and maintaining price signals to encourage the transition to carbon neutrality. At the same time, the acceleration of the development of alternative sources of energy must go forward. This is also a form of energy.
Can I just interrupt you to speak up a bit more, because
you can't hear me well? Okay.
Well, it's okay, but if you speak up a bit louder, it would be easier. Yeah.
Well, I can certainly speak louder myself. So the acceleration of the development of alternative sources of energy should certainly go forward. So supporting energy efficiency improvements and ensuring that networks and infrastructure are adapted to zero carbon technologies. That is also a form of energy support, but not to fossil fuels. Investing in capacities for energy users to adapt their energy consumption and shift to alternative fuels should also be in the package. And with that, I leave it here. Sorry, participants and chair, if I was not clear enough in my talking here. Thanks.
No, it was. Thanks a lot. It was clear. Perhaps it wasn't completely loud, but it was clear. Thanks a lot. You have indicated what the prices are and the severe impact on the most vulnerable households, and it's nice to see that you have these design principles for measures related to energy. You referred also that, of course, this has to be done in conformity with, and I think you were referring to WTO principles. Not easy to put in practice. At the same time, much appreciated that you present advice at the end, and also very elucidative what comes out of the OECD tracker of energy support measures for income support, price support, fossil fuel, non-fossil fuel. household and firms. Just a question, Frank, Mr. Van Tongeren. Which countries have you included in the database of country analysis?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So in this tracker, we include all the OECD countries, so that's 38, plus China, India, Indonesia, Romania, and South Africa for the moment.
Okay, thanks a lot. And of course, we'll come back to you most likely with other questions. And following Mr. Van Tongeren, we are pleased to have Jonas Kuhl here next to me from the International Institute of Sustainable Development. And I think you can build upon the previous two speakers, I'm quite sure, but please go ahead with your intervention.
Thank you very much. And I'm very happy to be here as well. So yeah, I was asked to speak a little bit about the developing country perspective of the current crisis. As what we have already discussed, it is a little bit different for developing countries, especially developed countries have not had many of like price subsidies for a long time. They have now been coming back a little bit, as we have just seen in the last presentation, but developing countries have still continued using those for a long time and face some serious issues because of those now. Go to the next slide, please. So regarding the impacts of the very high energy prices on developing countries, we certainly know that there are two types. So there's those direct impacts and also indirect. So as first speaker has already mentioned today is that there's a significant crisis on energy access, especially in developing countries. And that is the main reason because developed countries have kind of been priced out by the rising energy prices and developed countries purchasing those. And on the other hand, we also have seen from various research that energy as an input for other products also can exacerbate other development issues, and particularly energy prices have an issue on food prices. So the connection mainly is because for the fertilizers used for food production, it's primarily natural gas is primarily used. So due to the high price of natural gas, there was a lower production of fertilizers, and that obviously has impacts on food production and therefore the prices as well. So yeah, that was just kind of like an introduction to the impacts that developing countries particularly are facing. You can go to the next slide, please. And in terms of the energy access and the energy prices, many developing countries are still trying to ensure energy access through the means that they have been using in the past so far. And in primarily many developing countries are still using kind of blanket price subsidies. So where prices are subsidized way below the actual market price of the energy commodity. And we can see here, Muthu already has mentioned these numbers. So these numbers come from Indonesia, and it just shows that how drastic now the increase has been on the subsidy spending in 2022. So basically there was more than tripling of the subsidies, of the energy subsidies in this year, just to keep them on a similar level than in the years before. And in particularly, these subsidies, the spending for energy subsidies in Indonesia are now making up 16% of all the government spending. So that is a significant number that kind of impairs also investments of the governments into other development issues. You can go to the next. On the other hand, so this is some study that ISD did on LPG subsidies in the Indian state of Jharkhand. So, but the finding of that research is kind of general. Always when you look at price subsidies. So basically, all these analyses find that the most wealthy parts of the societies are usually benefiting much more from these subsidized prices. And the reason mainly is that usually these people and these groups have higher consumption patterns, or they even have consumption, because if there's a subsidized price on motor fuels, and somebody from the lower quintiles usually maybe do not have cars, then they do not benefit at all from these subsidies. So that is also important just to mention in that discussion, that it kind of aggregates the inequality between wealthy and poorer parts of the households. So we can move to the next slide, please. So all of that kind of like the very high fiscal burden, but also this inefficiency in actually delivering the social protection of those that actually need it, kind of make ending or reforming subsidized energy prices kind of a need for developing countries. At ISD, and we always say that there's normally good times to do subsidy reform, and those are the times when the international prices are lower, because obviously in these times the impacts of changing from subsidized to non-subsidized prices is much lower than in times of where the international energy prices are high. So unfortunately, as we can see from the slides, we are currently in a time of high energy prices, but I think the message is just that there is no time to wait for moving to reform, and also we do not know when it would be that energy prices are going down again, or if at all. So that's why even though maybe the current time is not the ideal time, governments are still need to act and need to move to reform their subsidized energy prices. So I brought this slides, and this graph just should show, so developing countries or many developing countries tend to use the following pricing model. So it's kind of like an ad hoc pricing. So basically, they try to keep the prices stable as long as possible until the fiscal burden is kind of like so large that there is no other way around to finally move and implement a very huge increase of energy prices. So that is what we can see in the graph on the left side, and we call it a big bang. So once it's kind of a sudden move from one day to the other, a price can increase by 30, 40, 50%. And what we see from many cases in countries, also there are several countries this year where this has happened, is that after such a huge increase of energy prices have been implemented, the people it hits the people very unexpectedly, and it often is followed by protests against the energy price increase itself, but also can often move to become actually an institutional crisis of countries. Next slide, please. So if we look at better ways to achieve price adjustments, we should actually look at what objectives we want from that process. So three things are important here. So a price adjustment mechanism should be ensuring fiscal sustainability, to ensure minimizing price fluctuation and minimizing fiscal volatility. So with fiscal sustainability, we mean that it should limit the amount of subsidies that is actually spent. Minimizing price fluctuations, it is basically what I've just explained, that there should not be too stark price increases, or also in general changes to prices, because it can hit people very unexpectedly and trigger these aggressive responses. And as a third part, it should also minimize fiscal volatility. So as the first speaker today has mentioned, in Indonesia, for example, the subsidy spending was 40% higher than what has been planned for. So that has issues on especially from the Ministry of Finances, because due to the sudden change in the spending needed for subsidies, that means there need to be changes in the financial planning, so, in a very short-term time. So that's why it should also avoid too high fiscal volatilities. Next one. So this is just a slide that shows different ways to have energy pricing methods. So the green line is what I've just described. So we have a long-term very stable prices until there is a sudden increase and a large increase in the price. And it actually does not, it works against all of these objectives that I've just mentioned. So it builds up a lot of subsidies over time, because you can see the line is always low, and the blue line is actually the price, the market price of the energy commodity. And but it also spurs these fluctuations, not fluctuations, but it spurs this stark increases, but also the volatility. So on the other spectrum of that would be that the prices are liberalized, and basically the market is deciding on how the prices look like. So that is the blue line. And what we can see here, it works good for the fiscal sustainability, because there are basically no subsidies. And it also works well for the fiscal volatility, because if there's no subsidies, there's obviously also no volatility in these fiscal impacts. However, there's the impact still that, as you can see from this blue line, there's a stark changes going up and down. It's and we're in very sudden and short terms. So a third method is actually a method that kind of smoothens this process. So it is still, it is a gradual process. So there's time to adjust to potential price increases. But for example, some countries using this formula, but then they limit the price changes to a certain percentage. For example, it's a maximum of 3% is allowed. And we have seen various countries using this model, and you can also see that regarding the objectives, basically it does not reduce all subsidies, but it certainly limits them a lot. And it's and the line, which is the red line explaining this method, it is much closer to the actual price, the actual market price, and the end of the timeline shown here, it is even higher. So it definitely avoids these very conflictual price changes that often trigger protests, and it significantly reduces the spending of for subsidies, because over time it more or less evens out what is spent on it. Next slide, please. However, as I mentioned, many countries and governments enact this method, which we suggest, especially also for developing countries. However, the process, it is important that the process is depoliticized, because what we also see sometimes government implement and adopt this approach, but it is still in the end the government who is deciding on the price. And in times of when there's high increases and that would mean long increases, governments stop to use this approach. So this is just what is shown on this slide. It's just an example from a country who in times of low energy prices, so during COVID, has actually adopted a price like an adjustment method with a smoothing factor of 1.5%. Because there was the government, so it was not a depoliticized process. So in 2021, it was adopted in 2020, and in 2021 there were some changes. So it was changed to 5%, then back to 3%. But you can see here, it is the orange line. This is the actual prices in the country, and you can see that they have just stopped enacting this price formula between April and September. And that is actually the time when the spending on subsidies are building up a lot. So we can see the blue line is actually the market price, whereas the gray line is the price it would be if the formula had been implemented. And we can see, so what is important to mention is that these formulas, they need to be automatic, and they need to be kind of moved away from the political processes where governments feel the need to keep the prices low to ensure a support from the constituencies. And so this is my last slide, and I just want to mention here that, as I mentioned in one of the earlier slides, the subsidizing energy prices is not an efficient way to ensure the social protection. And that's why we advocate for removing those subsidized energy prices. But there's still, as we have heard in the other interventions, there's the need to protect the vulnerables and poor and some groups of the societies. So it is important that while these subsidized prices are phased out, these groups still receive support to meet their needs, etc. So it is important now, and this is what we try to promote, that it is not the fuel that is subsidized, but it is the people. So that gives the people the independence also to decide how they want to spend. So, for example, trying to find a more energy efficient method than, or trying to find greener alternatives instead. So that is also where the part of the climate aspects come into this discussion. So we have also, from our own research, we know there's many countries that have done that. So they have phased out the subsidized energy prices and then protected poor and vulnerable groups specifically through, for example, cash transfers, but also other parts like spending, government spending in education or in healthcare systems. And we also, from our research, know that many countries have exactly used these methods to protect their people during the COVID pandemic. So they can certainly build on their experiences in those times, where they also had less time and a little time to actually think through very difficult programs, but they needed to be pragmatic and find pragmatic solutions. It is also important as part of it that governments communicate this correctly and build and through that build the public support that they need. So it is important for governments to show that they are not only taking away energy, like subsidized energy prices from the people, but they're actually using some of that money and spend it on those that really depend on it. And in the end, that can even improve the livelihoods of these people than in the setting where there's these energy prices. So it is important for governments to kind of stop that link between the social protection and low energy prices, but make there are people aware that these energy prices are connected to the international energy prices, but the government is and those should be follow those. Otherwise, governments will struggle with a fiscal drain. But on the other hand, they can use these savings and support those that actually need. Okay, that was my last slide. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonas, for this focus on developing countries. You refer to the direct impact, but also the huge indirect impact of higher energy prices. And by the way, a few weeks ago, I'm also chairing the Committee on Agriculture. So within the framework of that committee, we discussed the fertilizer situation worldwide. And as far as the nitrogen component in fertilizers, there's almost a direct link to energy prices. So this clearly highlights, of course, the huge direct impacts, of course, which we also see reflected in inflation, of course. You also mentioned the challenges that governments are facing, like Toru, when he talked about the fiscal burden, and you gave us some opportunity to look into that, to soften volatility or to smoothen, of course, the model, if you as you described it. I think you also made an interesting remark that if you use more energy, you qualify for more subsidies, which is fair enough. But at the same time, how does that relate to inclusivity, and how does that relate, I would say, to people who have been saving energy or have been working in a very environmental friendly manner, and then all of a sudden are less compensated if you only take into account, of course, their energy consumption. And this leads you to the point that perhaps we should not only subsidize fuel, but should subsidize people more in that respect. And I can only echo that your statement that we have no time to wait. This is actually the motto of this Environment Week. I think the ambassador of the United Kingdom said we should listen, we should discuss, and then we should also move into action. Of course, that's well taken. So thank you for completing those 3 excellent introductions. I would now like to trigger a bit of questions and answers among yourselves, perhaps. Jonas, to start with you, you've already given, I think, good advice to government, being a non-governmental institution, of course, a think tank, an NGO. I think it's important also to go back to the intervention of Toru when he said that this crisis should not be seen as working against climate change or being triggered even by the use of green energy. What would be your advice to government? How should they put their climate measures and green energy into a proper perspective, given what you've said?
Well, yeah, thanks so much for this question. So, yes, so exactly. So the point taken here is that what we also have many research on at ISD is we do some modeling, and it shows what are the impacts of the fossil fuel subsidies on the climate and the emissions. So we can clearly see if once governments reform their subsidies, we have a lot of I think it will be emission savings up to like 6% overall, but also in some countries it will be much higher, like up to 35%. So as I just mentioned before, it should give governments like this knowledge that we have to kind of separate the energy prices from the social protection part is important, because we need to because yeah, it has to be separated, because we because it will always also come back to us. So we are now in this in this time of very high energy prices, so that's why it is building up, and it may be coming back to the prices times where there's lower energy prices and where it may be fiscally easier for governments to deal with. But it just it is important for governments to move away from that kind of traditional view. And that has the implications then also on the climate aspect. So if governments consider that there should not be any subsidies and that should be competitive prices, that will also obviously be better for renewables to be taken up, because nowadays what we often see is that fossil fuels are artificially made cheaper through these fossil fuel subsidies. So it hinders the uptake also in that perspective.
Thank you. And again, also thank you for reaffirming that sustainable energy also means energy which is affordable for all, and the notion of inclusivity has to be taken on board as well. Thanks. Thanks, Frank. Can I turn to you now, because I was struck by the presentation from IISSD. At a certain moment, I thought this could have been the OECD also advising some of those important lessons. So perhaps you could reflect a bit on the information that Jonas gave us on how to soften or smoothen, of course, the subsidization system, and how to move into transitions. So I think this also refers perhaps to what you called the ideal situation, and the fact that it is difficult to put it into practice. But do you think that what Jonas put forward could be helpful for governments as well?
Well, it's good to see there is some convergence of minds here as regards supporting energy prices, lowering them artificially. Now, there's clearly a question of timing here. So the long-term objective of reducing fossil fuel use, doing something about the climate, and the short-term imperative to do something for the population and companies right now with these higher energy prices. And in this situation, artificially lowering prices looks like a quick fix that countries turn to. Unfortunately, that quick fix is slow to undo, as we know. Experience shows that reversing these price support measures is incredibly hard to do. We have lots of experience of those in agriculture, for example. Energy will probably be more complicated because it even concerns more people and more budgets, bigger budget impact. So it's very difficult to get out of those, but it's important to do so, because if you don't, then the incentives are simply not right for the long-term objectives. Long-term objectives, that means reducing fossil fuel use, etc. So what I said earlier, I think moving away from this market price, from these price support measures towards more targeted income support would be the avenue to take. And I think the colleague from IISD has mentioned that as well. Now, the problem is how you do that. So Jonas said, okay, we do as much as possible depoliticize. We do kind of automatic formula that somehow are baked into the system. That is already a step that would help some governments towards that objective. But probably something more aggressive needs to be done right now in the situation where we see these support measures popping up as an urgent response to this energy crisis, even in those countries that are not traditionally using those measures. So we believe it's important that these, that even politicians and policymakers are somehow shielded from these influences. Now, to do that is of course not easy, but making these measures, when they are contemplated, time-bound is already an important step. Having a clear view and communicating about when they are phased out is important in that, so the expectations are right, so that actually consumers, households, firms have the opportunity to adjust to a high price environment, which is probably, as Togo also said, probably here to stay for a while. So if you do that, you have to do two things. You have to move away from this price support move it into something that is more targeted, supporting people's incomes, but it would also add firms where necessary, but it has to be tested where really the need is. So re-instrumenting, if you want, but also using the monies that are now being spent to accelerate investments into the development of alternative sources of energy, which would serve towards your long-term objectives of reducing fossil fuel use and their bad effects on the environment and climate. So all that sounds, of course, much easier than it is in practice, because in practice there is this imperative to do something now, and so to speak, to shoot from the hip, to do something immediately. But I think that is the discussion that we're having here. That's why we're here in this room, even if virtually, to see what kind of advice could we give to governments about that. And so re-instrumenting away from this price support, which is really the most untargeted support that you can imagine there, and as well, just not giving the right incentives that we need for the longer term transition to greener energy. I'll leave it here for the moment. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Very, very helpful. Mr. Toro, in this panel round of questions, you mentioned the parallels to the energy shocks of the 1970s. And I remember that as a child, you know, in the Netherlands, there was no traffic because we didn't have enough petrol, and it was a big shock. I think it was the first shock after 2 decades of prosperity, growth, abundance of energy, and all of a sudden this came to a halt, literally. So if you fast forward 50 years to now, what lessons from that time are applicable now, and how do governments ensure they are well prepared for future shocks, minimizing reliance on fossil fuel subsidies as a response tool? So how do you see this analogy, and what are the lessons we can draw from that now?
Yeah, thank you for this very interesting question. Yeah, so in my view, this point is very important, particularly to come up with how to tackle with current crisis, as you suggested. And as I mentioned, the oil crisis in the 70s brought structural changes of energy sector. I think that is the point of the analogy of a half of century ago and now. And let me give some example. First of all, the car, the vehicles, the amount of gasoline needed for 100 kilometers for an average car was 18 liters before the oil crisis. But after the crisis, because of lots of effort to improve the energy efficiency, the gasoline volume had dropped to 10 liters in 1970. So just 10 liters were needed for 100 kilometers for an average car. Almost it dropped half from 18 to 10 liters. And another example is, I think, nuclear. Many countries rushed to build nuclear reactors during the 70s. That is, they were responding to the oil security concerns as well as fuel economy issues. And actually, as a result of this rush of nuclear reactors building, based on analysis, 40% of current nuclear reactors in the world were built in 1970s. So actually, during 70s, so after the oil crisis, many structural changes had happened. And comparing with these responses a half century ago, I think we have 2 big advantages to be optimistic. The first advantage is now many clean energy technologies are available. It is different from 50 years ago. And many of these technologies are already affordable or becoming affordable in many parts of the world. This should be a great advantage of us comparing with 50 years ago and to tackle this current crisis. That is the first point I would like to suggest. And the second point is we have Paris Agreement and Glasgow Climate Pact. It is also a different point. We didn't have that kind of global agreement 50 years ago. And now the world has this consensus to reduce the emissions and the use of fossil fuels, which would strongly accelerate governments to take actions to reduce the use of fossil fuels and to take green energy technologies. And these are 2 points of the different point comparing with the 50 years ago. And based on this observation, I think lessons and further efforts we can do against this crisis is actually, as Frank also addressed, alternative sources. That is important. In my word, that is structure change. So, as Jonas pointed out, current situation is a little difficult to reform the subsidies itself, as Jonas pointed out. But on the other hand, current time should be a chance to reform the structural changes to implement alternative sources such as massive improvement of efficiencies such as house, insulated house or electric vehicles, that kind, and heat pumps, that kinds of structure changes and alternative sources would be a good option to be implemented this time, particularly thinking about the lessons from a half-century ago's lessons. And I hope this would be an answer to your question. Thank you.
Oh yes, it's. I think it's more than an answer. I asked you to compare one crisis with another crisis, and you come up with an optimistic view. So that is, I think, exactly what we need in this this environment week. And you're referring, of course, to the development and the availability of technologies at hand. I think we have proven technologies in the market already, of course, which can be now used as well. But at the same time, you clearly indicated that this is about systemic changes. I think also Jonas and Frank has referred to that we should not underestimate this this challenge. And your reference to global availabilities is also critical. I'm also looking at James, of course. This is an issue. We're here at the World Trade Organization, and to make, of course, those technologies available, for example, to make services, green services available. These are issues, of course, which we have to look into as members of the World Trade Organization as well. What can we do there to promote this systemic change? And so thanks a lot for those questions and answers. And now, indeed, we have quite some time also for some questions from the floor and via Zoom. Please, Madam, you have the floor.
Alev Mine of the One Goal Initiative. Mr. Kuhl, your graphs comparing subsidized and unsubsidized and smooth curves, they tended to have a pattern that goes up and down afterwards. One question is, what happens if it doesn't come back down, right? When the market price doesn't actually come back down. And then the other thing is subsidizing people. So that brings two issues. If a country subsidizes certain people, they tend to also require a certain level of control over those people. They have them sign out something that says, now we are entitled to do this and that in your stead, or we are entitled to, at any point in time, you know, get information about anything about you, or even step into your house, etc. So wouldn't that create somehow, you know, a class of controlled people versus a class of freer people? And then the second point with that is that somehow, well, subsidizing people or the fuel itself, that somehow transfers some externality from the business to the taxpayer in some way. And externality, I guess it can also be called the downside of the business. So those would be my questions or points.
Jonas?
Thank you very much for those questions. And maybe, yeah, I can start with the first one. So the numbers I have seen so far, there was always some like fluctuations in the market. So in the end, international oil prices have come down again. So, but if that is not the case, the smoothing model of these automatic adjustment, they would after a certain time also catch up with the international prices. So so it is very unlikely that international prices will always continue going up, but at one point will go with a little bit less stark increase. So at one point there would be those prices would have caught up. And I think that is also maybe, yeah, this is important to mention again, that approach is going away from that ad hoc, going up to a gradual approach. So people have time and see where is actually the journey going, but they have time to adapt and get ready, and maybe alternatively invest in other technologies, potentially reducing their energy consumption. So just wanted to stress that aspect of the gradual process again. So, but after a while, even with that model, the prices would catch up. And regarding your second point, I guess that is the case. I think I have not heard any arguments about that issue so far in when there's these discussions. So I'm not exactly sure what what to say and respond at this stage. I would also say that giving direct cash benefits or etc. So that is one alternative. Other alternatives, as I mentioned, is also investments in education, healthcare, which would then make it more accessible for less wealthy groups, for example. So and benefit them directly. So I could not, I would need to come back and think a little bit more about that aspect, about how would you call it? Maybe data and data knowledge and less maybe freedom. So that argument. So I cannot respond to that right now, but I could come back to that.
Yeah, it's an intriguing question, but your point was intriguing as well. I think there's a bit of an analogy, by the way, with food. You've got, of course, the opportunity to subsidize food for poor people, but you could also think about cash transfers. And there's experience in how many conditions you should or should not attach to cash transfers for people to be able to buy their own food. I think we can draw that analogy. But perhaps also, Frank, if you may want to come in on this issue, I think in the end it's also basically the ministers of finance, isn't it, we're talking about? So they also have opportunities, of course, to change tax regimes in one way or another. But do you have any Anything to add to the question, the second question?
No, to the second question already. But I mean, I said again, I think there are good examples of targeted cash transfer programs, including in some developing countries, including Indonesia, by the way, who has been leading the way with some quite innovative things there some time ago. But I wanted to make another point, and that is about the level of the prices, although that's probably more the IEA's turf. But in as far as countries reduce their demand for fossil fuels now in response to the high energy prices, markets should react and prices should come down, no? Over time. So that already will help ease that situation. What we then would hope is that not we get into something that Ron Steinblick in the chat called, was it subsidy complacency or something? So because prices in the longer run may come down, that still doesn't mean we shouldn't work towards removing fossil fuel subsidies. But also to those who are in the chat now saying, okay, what's developing countries? The hits are very big. What can we do? Again, transition or reducing demand for fossil energies in the end is to the benefit of all. In the shorter run, or hopefully, reduced demand will also reduce prices there, and that will also ease the situation a little bit.
Thank you.
So for the moment, yes.
Thanks. Oh, you were already referring to the chat. I'm looking at James. Do you have one or two questions that you pick up in the chat that the panel could answer?
Yes, absolutely. And thank you to our sort of 70-strong contingent of participants that are joining us online. Perhaps for Jonas's and Marcel's benefit, I can refer to the questions that Frank referred to. So the first one was from Ron Steinblick, who notes that Masami Kojima, who is the World Bank's leading expert on fuel pricing, has questioned whether a period of low prices are more favorable for reforming price-related subsidies. She apparently points out that such periods engender complacency and the subsidy reform by default, but often the reforms are not necessarily durable and are abandoned or overturned when prices rise again. So Ron is interested in the panel's thoughts on that. There's also a question inviting comment about energy subsidies in oil producing countries. So what might the impact be of subsidy reform in producing countries on the current crisis? And then finally, going to the interest on developing country member perspectives, a couple of sort of more general questions about how developing countries can be supported to transition to more sustainable energy production and use. So perhaps picking up on the comments that have been made around the structural changes necessary to increase resilience on energy shocks like the one that's currently been faced, but that gives a flavor of the discussion online. Thanks again to those participants and to our panelists.
Definitely, yes, and thanks for keeping an eye on the chat, and please do continue to use it. So perhaps we could pick up some of those questions. I'm not going to direct you, but let's have a round of the three panelists. And Mr. Muta, could you perhaps take the floor on any of these questions? So there was one on the impact of energy subsidies in producer countries, the developing country perspective, and then, of course, the issue that Jonas also raised: when is the most appropriate time to take action? When prices are high or prices are low? Please, you have the floor. Either of one of these questions is appropriate if you want.
If I may, so let me take the second question, the impact on the energy producing countries. So IEA is also analyzing fossil fuel subsidies in oil or gas producing countries. And our definition is the opportunity cost, that is, actually, in oil or gas producing country, the actual cost of producing fossil fuels are, in many cases, quite low. But thinking the opportunity cost, that is, these countries can sell these fossil fuels with international prices to other countries. So they can export these fuels to foreign countries with international prices. Instead, in many countries, distribute these fossil fuels domestically with lower prices. That means the difference between international price and lower domestic price can be recognized as opportunity cost, and that could be by our definition fossil fuel consumption subsidies. And our suggestion is it is quite important for oil or gas producing countries to use fossil fuel exporting revenues to invest in other parts of the industries or economies in the countries to diversify its industry in the country. So our recommendation is not just distributing fossil fuels within the country with cheaper price, but it would be very important to diversify their industries by using that opportunity cost to export their fossil fuels to the other countries, particularly considering current clean energy transition. Oil and gas producing countries are required to reform their industrial structure to fit the coming clean energy transition. So that is a takeaway or a recommendation for oil and gas producing countries from the perspective of fossil fuel subsidy reforms. It is.
Thank you. Yes,
yeah.
this is very relevant, and I, if you would allow me, I think to some extent that's also true for major actors, of course, in the fossil fuel industry, because they of course are good in producing or distributing or making energy available. So that technology, of course, could also be transformed towards the new courses. So I have a question in the floor. Frank, I'll come back to you as well later, but please, sir, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you. One of the appreciated presenters proposes that it is the time of crisis is very suitable time to reduce fossil subsidies. And at the same time, he proposed that government in different countries could increase subsidy for people, social welfare. In case of having both of them, unsubsidized oil prices and subsidized incomes for people, to what extent government can control rate of inflation in the future? And to what extent government would be able to restore the previous moderate rate of inflation as was in the previous years? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Excellent question. Frank, can I refer to you also with this question or any of the other outstanding ones?
Yes, well, I'd be happy to. I mean, this right now we hear a lot of arguments that to fight inflation we need to reduce energy prices, because that's a big portion of your expenditure basket. So if you would reduce those, we would also reduce inflation. That may be true in the short run, but not in the longer run, because what you want to do as well is to reduce the fossil fuel consumption in the longer term. Otherwise, the pressure will continue. It's also not true in a way, or not true, and that's not a good way to say it. But so in as far as these price subsidies need to be financed somehow from a government budget, that will have an upward inflationary pressure. So it has to be, these subsidies have to be financed somehow. It has to come from somewhere. So that will mean that the cost of government borrowing will rise, the interest rates will rise, etc. So I think it's again what I tried to say earlier. It looks like a short-term fix for many problems, but with many long-term undesirable consequences. Longer-term inflation may be one. Another one, the fact that it's not giving the right incentives actually to reduce fossil fuel consumption going forward. So, and that's, I think, is a shared objective here, that we need to reduce that. So in that sense, I would be very cautious about that argument to use support or reduce energy prices to combat inflation. Maybe a short-term fix, but with long-term negative consequences potentially. And as we've seen as well, also with rather unpredictable consequences for your finance minister, because the size of the money that has to be given depends really on the international markets that are out of his control, or her control. There were also, I mean, the questions about developing countries. I mean, that's quite clear that there the impacts are severe, they're big, they go also into food production, as was mentioned earlier, both through the fertilizer prices, but also transport, etc. Now, how then to facilitate a transition to more sustainable energies in those countries that don't have the fiscal space that some, at least of our OECD countries have? I would say, again, there is an interest, I think, for everyone to reduce these fossil fuel subsidies in the first place, which distort the incentives towards a transition towards more sustainable energies. So there's an interest here to facilitate that transition by reducing those subsidies and spending the money more wisely to invest in this development of more alternative energy sources that will benefit everyone, including developing countries. So getting out of these fuel subsidies, I think, would also be beneficial for developing countries in the longer run. Then, as the chair had already mentioned, in the WTO, there are some discussions ongoing on environmental services, environmental goods trade, to make that more flow more easily, and those should also help to transfer technologies, transfer knowledge, transfer people even, so that this transition to more sustainable energies can be facilitated. And we'll just leave it here, Chair, if you allow.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, we have a few more minutes, but Jonas, in response to any of the issues?
Yes, sure. I'd like to comment on the question about the right timing, because I brought that up. So I thought I'd just give it a quick comment. So I mentioned that times of low energy prices are good times to do reforms, and I meant that in theory those are the good times, because this is when the impacts, or the immediate impacts, would be the smallest. So we also track at ISD which country is doing what type of fossil fuel subsidy reform. So we certainly know that, for example, during the COVID pandemic, when prices were down and it was a good time to do reform of subsidized prices, not so many governments have actually done it. And those, as I mentioned, as I had one example who actually used this automatic price adjustment, have then followed afterwards, when prices went up, do not continue using these formulas, for example. So I think why governments are not doing it in these times is also because the immediate pressure is certainly comparably low in these times, compared to times with higher energy prices, where the subsidies tend to be much higher. So that's just why it brought me back to what I've been saying during my first intervention, where I said that no matter what the time is, so we have to separate these parts. So we have to move to non-subsidized prices, even in the time when it is when there's high energy prices right now, but continue to finding other opportunities to actually deliver to protect the people, not through the fuel.
Thank you. Thank you all. This brings us to the conclusion of this panel, but I'm not sure really how to conclude. I think this has been very rich. I thank the three panelists, Jonas here next to me. Frank, also thanks a lot for joining us from the OECD, and Toru, you of course from the Energy Agency. Thanks a lot for Henry, and thanks also for those who've asked questions in these last rounds. Personally, I think the insights are very useful. We hope, of course, directly relevant to all of you involved in this subject matter. Within the World Trade Organization, the Friends of Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reforms, those countries that have signed up to the declaration that I referred to in the beginning, will definitely look into this session and its outcomes. Last week there was already an excellent meeting on transparency as regards subsidies provided, and James, I think there's quite an intensive work program ahead of the group. And let me just also reiterate that this group is open and that all other WTO members are very welcome to join, or of course to send their remarks or views to the discussion. So thanks again for all the participants here, and there are an awful lot online wherever you are in the world. At least you saved a lot of energy not having to come to Geneva, but I'm just as delighted to have a lot of delegates here in the room also during this week. And thanks again for the WTO for its support. Thanks for the interpretation also with us here. Please do enjoy your evening or the rest of your morning or afternoon, wherever you are in this beautiful world. Thank you.
Bye.